Okay, I have 11 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started in respect of your time. I will let you know that I do have all of the participants muted so that we can reduce background noise. I am recording this session so that we can make it available on our YouTube website for future viewing by either your agency or other agencies. So if you have questions at any point in time, I would ask that you use the chat feature and just type those in. I will make sure to kind of keep an eye on that. There are some questions, some slides that ask for some audience participation. So hopefully we have some fast typers out there and we can take advantage of that. But want to say welcome. My name is Robin Donaldson. I am the Chief Operating Officer at Indiana Youth Services Association. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be kind of a basic overview of evidence-based practices and programs specific to youth services. And I just did this actual workshop in Atlanta last week for the federal funded runaway and homeless youth programs. And so I hope that you guys find it as useful. It was a very, of course, doing it face to face was a little bit easier. It was very interactive. It will be a little bit harder to do it online, but please take advantage of that chat feature to kind of, like I said, ask questions and participate. So we are going to just kind of talk about the basic difference between evidence-based, evidence-driven, and best practices, and have hopefully give you a really clear understanding of those differences and what to look for. We will also look a little bit at how to assess organizational capacity for implementing evidence-based programs. There are some things that need to be in place, and so we will discuss what those are, and then talk about how to find and select an appropriate evidence-based or best practice for your youth service population, depending upon which program you are planning to implement. So again, if you have any questions along this, please feel free to just go ahead and chat and type those in, and I will answer them as they show up. So we're just going to start by talking about a definition of evidence-based. And this is where I want to hear from you first. What do you think are going to be characteristics that or kind of key words in a definition for evidence-based practice or programs? Remember, type those in. All right. Our Family Resources says it is backed up by research. And I think that that's probably one of the clearest ways to think about evidence-based program is that it is kind of one of those things that has some research out there. It's not because we think it works, that we have anecdotal evidence, but there's really some research with strong methodology, typically done by an academic, type of organization, and you can have some input by the agency as well. But usually it's a third party around that. And we'll talk a little bit about how to assess the validity of claims for evidence-based program a little bit later on. But that's kind of a really good distinction. If we look at kind of the federal standard definition for evidence-based practice, it is this first bullet talking about bringing together the best available research as well as input from the professional community and the clients that the service is supposed to be targeting. And all of this has those demonstrated positive outcomes. So, and that's the research piece, is that it actually will demonstrate those positive outcomes. If we looked at the definition by the American Psychological Association, it also then talks about this integration of research, the expertise within the field, and specific client either input or characteristics that would make something evidence-based. If we think about this in terms of the federal government, if we have any programs that have federal funding, especially federal funding through the Family Youth Services Bureau and the Runaway Homeless grants, then they define evidence-based programs along these 4 priorities for youth service programs. And those are that they contribute to the safety of the young people that we are working with. They will enhance the well-being of the young people. It will facilitate permanent connections with caring adults. We know in research that that is one of the things that is most consistent in terms of resilience and a protective factor for young people who may be at risk and do not have all of the resources and opportunities provided to them. And that the permanent connection is huge. And then look at the fact that they will facilitate self-sufficiency, typically through the acquisition of skills. And those skills can be independent life skills. It can be emotional, social skills, interpersonal communication skills. It can be fiscal management. All of those things that we think of that would be necessary for a young person to be successful on their own and independent. So there's pretty broad definition in terms of what is considered evidence-based, but those key terms of what is that integrated input from research and from the field and the clients themselves tends to be a really, really good working model. And it's why the feds use, why the runaway homeless youth field uses that particular definition. I think that there's some confusion in thinking about evidence-based because these terms, evidence-based, evidence-driven, and best practices, many times are used interchangeably when really there are some very clear distinctions about what is evidence-based versus what is evidence-driven and best practices. Typically, those evidence-based practices and programs are those that have demonstrated that effectiveness, so it matches the definition. They've demonstrated effectiveness through rigorous research. Typically, this research is done by an outside third party represented by an experimental and control group. And usually it is someone in the academia who's doing this type of research. So you will typically have someone who is working with a university to actually do this type of research. A lot of times it might be a master's student, and they have taken this on as their thesis around that, but it's that third party backup around this. Evidence driven is going to be those programs that demonstrate effectiveness typically through what is called soft research or qualitative research. It is very difficult to do a control group and an experimental group in youth services because, ethically speaking, we cannot deny services that we think to be effective to the young people in need. And so a lot of those control groups have to be those that are found typically within the field, kind of hard to do. So a lot of the research that we have is more evidence driven, based upon qualitative research, which typically is going to be a standardized evaluation that is filled out by the participants, talking about their experiences, their perceptions, and their actions. It can be measured through statistical significance in pre and post test changes, or it can be a behavioral assessment that's done pre and post that demonstrates a, like I said, statistically significant difference from the beginning of services to the end of services. So, the difference here really is that there's not that control group, and it is more based upon word of mouth and a lot of interviewing and evaluation, as opposed to that rigorous type of research in which one group is not actually benefiting from the experience. Best practices will be a blend of formal evaluation findings. Typically, those formal evaluations are done by the agency in question who's providing that. So it may be without that third party, but you have a formal evaluation in set, and you do that formal evaluation. And it also includes the prevailing wisdom in the field. So again, you have that kind of integration of some standardized, formalized testing and collection of data, and then what seems to be kind of the expertise in the field around that. You guys have questions about the difference between evidence-based, evidence-driven, and best practices? And you can respond just yes or no by, typing in that chat feature, so I can make sure you guys all have this understanding. Are y'all letting Bridget speak for you? That there are no questions? All right, I'll move on, and if you do have questions, then I will go ahead and you can just type them in, and I will respond as they come up. I think another thing that kind of muddies the field, if you will, when we are talking about evidence-based, is this difference between practices and programs. And there is a real distinction between what is an evidence-based practice and what is an evidence-based program. A lot of the kind of hot topics that are being talked about in evidence-based are really kind of practices. So a practice is an approach or a framework. It is how we actually think about what we are doing that kind of guides our interactions with our clients. Whereas a program has a set of coordinated activities. You actually will have a curriculum. It will lay out, the questions that you're supposed to ask. Typically, it will also come with a formalized evaluation in that. It can also include activities. So you have, it's the guide of how to provide these types of services. So kind of based on these definitions, can you guys think of examples of evidence-based practices that we are currently talking about in the field of youth service? What would be considered a framework or a guide? Restorative justice. Okay, that would be one. Kind of specific to juvenile justice. Those type, if you're working, with OJ, with Office of Juvenile Justice delinquency prevention, that certainly is one. Other ideas of a practice, an evidence-based practice. There were a couple of them that were required in the latest round of the FYSB RFP, the 1503 RFP. And I know I have a couple of grant writers on here. Someone else give me another example of an evidence-based practice. I know you're out there. And type something in. And I will remind you, if you have just joined us, I do have everyone muted, so you will have to use the chat feature to answer the questions. I don't, so if you're saying something, I'm not able to hear you. All right, and Jay County says trauma focused CBT. Is that what you mean? Trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy? Okay, all right, thank you. All right. And I typically trauma informed, so I would say, let me make this distinction. I think that trauma informed care certainly is a practice. Trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy does come with some specific guidelines and activities that you would do. So while trauma-informed is a practice, trauma-informed CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, would be considered a program because it has some real specific activities that you are supposed to implement if you are doing trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's, you may not get a curriculum, but there are those specific guidelines and those specific therapeutic techniques that just as a whole make up cognitive behavioral therapy as a whole. Other examples of evidence-based practices would include the search for developmental assets. So you get kind of this framework for interaction that provides you kind of the goals of what you are attempting to provide for your young people. And positive youth development would also be another example of evidence-based practice. So it gives you some ideas about what to do, but it's kind of that framework of really kind of engaging the young person and providing them with meaningful roles without a real kind of curriculum. When we think of evidence-based programs, then that what should come to mind in terms of evidence-based programming really is more about that list that I provided when let me give you something to think about. That list that I provided when you guys filled out the when you submitted your RFPs. So certainly cognitive trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, or just cognitive behavioral therapy in general, a very effective and probably most used practice, evidence-based practice around substance abuse would be 7 challenges. If you're doing mentoring, Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, is an evidence-based program that will show up on those registries and those lists of best practices and evidence-based models. The kind of list goes kind of on and on. Motivational therapy or motivational interviewing. The Casey assessment would also be evidence-based program because it comes with the curriculum. So you have, quite a few that are going to be those evidence-based or evidence-driven. A lot of the programs that are listed on the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Association Administration, their National Registry for Evidence-Based Practices and Programs may be qualitative, they may be more evidence-driven, and they have a distinction about which of those it kind of fits around that. Why would we use trauma or evidence-based practices? Guys, give me one or two reasons why we would use evidence-based practices or programs in our youth services. to show effectiveness. Very, very good. Yeah. Other reasons? Gave you guys time to chat. Any other? Why do you talk about evidence-based? Why are you at this training? Yeah, to meet compliances with grants and contracts because it's required from our funders. Certainly is one of the reasons. Because we already know that it is going to have positive outcomes because the research has been done to demonstrate that. So you guys are kind of you've got it. Certainly we want to be able to provide the best quality services to our young people. And if we are using evidence-based services, then it already has that kind of distinction. It's already been proven. So we know that we are doing the best that we can possibly do using an evidence-based practice or program. It also provides this standardized service delivery so that it will create kind of consistency among our programming. Consistency of programming for each individual client, as well as consistency of programming. If we think about this in terms of youth services across the state of Indiana, if we are using evidence-based mentoring programs or evidence-based counseling, then we can really talk about the fact that there is this standardized quality service that is being provided to young people. All right, guys, a couple people mentioned it has been proven to be effective. And we can continue to look at what we are doing specifically using evidence-based program because, as I said, it usually comes with its own evaluation. So then we can evaluate our implementation of that program. We can actually look and see how effective we are in providing those services based upon that. And we can demonstrate those outcomes. And typically those outcomes more and more are being demanded by the stakeholders, by our funders, by the folks who are making decisions about programming. So it allows us to kind of be ahead of the game, if you will, about showing that we are doing what is most effective and has an impact. That's really kind of what we want to be doing. I think probably the best reason to use evidence-based practices or programs is because it has the greatest impact on our clients. It reduces the effects and risks of trauma so that we are not re-traumatizing our young people as they come into programs, which has happened in the past. It also so it reduces risk, but it also builds those protective factors and it builds those skills. And any effective programming for young people will be doing those two things: building protective factors and reducing the risk around kind of their behavior and their environment. Also mentioned was that we are required to do this by our funders. And it is, if you think about, the demands that our foundations, certainly the federal government, our state government, get in terms of, the money, it's limited money that's available for youth services. But this allows us to talk about money that is well spent. That it's not just because we think it works, that it's actually been proven to work. And so, you are getting quality services by the dollars that you're spending, particularly in prevention, because we know that prevention is much more cost effective than intervention in the long run. And so we can talk about the fact that this is a good investment of those state, federal, and foundation or corporate dollars. And that is very, very compelling, especially given the competitiveness of our funding. You can't just decide that you're just going to go out and do an evidence-based program or practice. You have to really kind of think about the things that would need to be in place and able to do this effectively. In research or in the field, it is implementing the program with fidelity, which means that you are able to follow those standards and those guidelines that are set out in the evidence base that has shown to be important in eliciting those positive outcomes. So in order to do that, there are certain things that your agency needs to have in place in order to do this. First, you have to be able to build support for evidence-based programs or practices. Now, the practices are easy in that the training that's required for the evidence-based practices typically tend to be really cost-effective. Certainly, if you have your association membership or other types of membership, it can be provided at no cost. So, certainly IYSA is doing that. If you have federal funding, a lot of times the grant technical support team will provide that as well. But you have to build the support for the evidence-based practices as well as your programs. Programs sometimes will require some funding, and so you're spending a little bit more money. So this requires that you have buy-in from all of those stakeholders, including your executive leadership, because they have to support the changes that may be required in implementing evidence-based practices or programs. It is certainly important to have the buy-in of the agency direct care staff, because if they are the ones who will be implementing the program, what we know is if they have a really strong buy-in and belief in the effectiveness, that kind of positive outlook and those positive expectations for change translate to our clients and our participants. And so, if they have buy-in, then that's great. They can go to training. You have executive support, but if your direct care staff thinks that it's just a bunch of hoo-ha, and they're just going through the motions, then the chances that it's going to have a really strong impact are lessened, because that does translate to your clients and your participants, which is another important part of the buy-in piece, is that your participants understand the value of participating. And if they understand that value, then they're more likely to stick around. It's easy to get the buy-in. It's easier to get the buy-in for evidence-based programs and practices for your funders and your decision makers because of all of those things that we've just talked about before. It's proven effective. You're doing quality services. It is a good bargain for the money that's being spent. But having that from your board and your funders is important as well. Not only do you have to implement kind of the program as it is spelled out, especially if we're talking about an evidence-based practice, it needs to be integrated into your agency policies and procedures. It does, especially practice, require a change in thinking, a change in the thought process and the basic interactions between the staff and the folks that we are serving, so whether it's the young people or the families. And so there is kind of that I mentioned the buy-in, but also that buy-in needs to be supported by your policies and your programs. Looking at whether or not they're reflecting those key characteristics. Are your policies and your procedures reflecting the key characteristics of the evidence-based practice? Are your staff members assessed and evaluated based upon their ability to implement evidence-based practices and programs? Do you have a subcommittee on your agency board of directors that is looking at the programs that are effective for your population and the programs that you're providing? Are they doing evaluation based upon the implementation of the program and making changes? So it's more than just saying, hey, we're going to do this. It really is kind of this entire buy-in. And it is important to train the entire staff on evidence-based principles, from your direct care staff to your administration to your secretarial staff. your maintenance staff, your ground staff, because there is the possibility that they're all going to have that opportunity to interact with your young people and the families. And so if this can be broadly implemented in terms of really guiding the interactions and recognizing that there's value in each individual interaction between a staff person and the folks that we're serving, it will just increase the ability to have a stronger impact on that. The last part, I think, is probably the part that is really most important but often forgotten when agencies decide to implement evidence-based practice and program, because we have to be able to make sure that we are doing this in a way that is consistent with the guidelines for practices and programs, which requires evaluation. And that evaluation allows us to, monitor and maybe pinpoint any weaknesses or gaps in implementation of programming and practice. And that's important because if there are those weaknesses and those gaps, then we need to be able to provide additional training or put those support services into place to make sure that we kind of close the gaps and we are implementing this with fidelity. So, doing things, like I said, including the implementation, how well are they implementing, let's say trauma-informed care practices or positive youth development practices in their interactions. Can you actually, when we did positive youth development, we had those kind of key features of what it looks like, what a staff interaction looks like if they're using positive youth development. So do you have that checklist in those? Are you using that to kind of monitor? Is your board of directors looking at your outcomes and the data that you're collecting through all of this to make sure that we're implementing this with fidelity and to get those outcomes that we want? There is a lot of research around what it takes to positively implement an evidence-based practice. And one of the things that, and there's a lot of things about what it takes and not a whole lot of tools in terms of being able to really assess the agency. I have found a tool that comes from the National Safe Place Network that is specific to just overall agency capacity. And so for those executive directors that are on this particular call, or if you want to let or folks who participate in the IYSA quarterly meeting, we will be using this tool to do agency assessment because it's just a very, very good overall tool. If it's something that you would like to look at prior to, just let me know. But that would be kind of part of this paper implementation. Paper implementation is when a program completes kind of this theory of change to develop buy-in for the program, to really look at what is necessary, and it's kind of your planning stage, if you will, for implementing evidence-based practices. So if you do an agency assessment, if you're doing a community needs assessment and a community strength mapping, all of those components would be part of the paper implementation. Just kind of what would it take if we were going to do this with fidelity? The next step is the process implementation, and this really is about then starting those activities, such as doing staff training, actually bringing people in or sending people out to get the training, to purchase the material, if it is a curriculum, and have that on hand and train staff on the implementation of those activities in the curriculum. So that's that process piece. And then there is the performance implementation, which really is then about providing those activities, that you're actually carrying out the program curriculum, you are carrying out the program activities, you are implementing those practices in your interactions with your young people and their families. and then doing the evaluation piece to look at how effective you are implementing the program. If you look at research around kind of agency capacity for evidence-based, you will see Fixon a lot. He's done a lot of research around this, and I have, I have his reference later on in the slide, so you can have that and maybe, start to look at that if you're interested in doing that as well. I do think when we think about this, and again, if you want that assessment, just email me and I can get that to you. We'll be doing this at a quarterly meeting, so everyone will have access to that. Probably, my hope is in March to be able to do that, because it is a good tool. But let me know if you want it prior to, just if you want to get a head start on this. I think we can also just broadly talk about the things that are going to be necessary for an agency in order to implement an evidence-based program or practice with fidelity. Certainly, you have to know what your community needs are. So whether it is, using a needs assessment that has already been done with your community, you do your own needs assessment, you have that kind of identified gap in services, and you have a basic knowledge of the evidence-based application and services and what it would take to find a program or a practice that would fill that gap. What do you need? And you have this basic understanding of evidence-based practice. You also need to be able to critically appraise your agency's capacity for implementing that. And again, that can be done through an agency capacity assessment as well. You want to be able to reach out and be able to provide those services to the population of need. Now, so can you, if you go through the process of identifying an evidence-based practice or program, you send your staff for training, can you actually provide these services to the clientele, to that targeted clientele? So you're going to look at things like transportation and where does it have to happen? Do you have that buy-in, or can you elicit the buy-in from the clients in being able to provide that? Again, buy-in is really, really important in terms of your community, your staff, your clientele, your stakeholders. It provides that kind of motivation for participating, for providing the services, and the capacity to implement the program to fidelity, which would include, do you have the staff on hand that could actually spend time to implement a practice, to implement a curriculum, to provide the activities? Do you have the money to buy the program curriculum if you need to, or to buy the supplies that would be necessary for that? Can you send them to the training? Some of this will require, especially the programs, will require that you're sending your staff off for training. So you have to have training dollars that are available, as well as the travel and all of the things that might entail, or being able to bring someone in and pay them to come in and do that type of training. So you have to look at that and whether or not that is feasible for your agency at this time, or can you find the funding, through foundations or sponsors to be able to do that. The ability to implement with fidelity also includes this piece about integrating especially if it's a practice, integrating the evidence-based practice into your policies and procedures. So actually following through and spending some time, whether it is a board of directors committee, whether it's a committee that is formed by your direct care staff or your management team, to look at your policies and your procedures and make sure that they match based upon those kind of leading characteristics or guidelines of the evidence-based program. Obviously, you want to be able to adhere to any funder requirements. And as I think the federal government is really moving toward requiring agencies to identify evidence-based practices and programs that they're going to implement in order to get that type of funding. So, if we are talking about a runaway or homeless program, then that has been a requirement for the last few years. This was the first year that we required kind of your focus on positive youth development and trauma-informed care in the 1503 funds and integrating that into your program as well. The state is, the Department of Child Services has, kind of identified trauma-informed care as being a valuable practice in terms of the service delivery and is doing training of their own staff, and probably won't be long that they'll be requiring that for anyone who's getting funding as well. And I'm just guessing. But it really does look like we are moving toward that. So being able to kind of understand what that means and then being able to meet that funding, those funding requirements is going to be important, which means that you have the ability to spend time on this administratively and that you do have a plan for sustainability. And typically that sustainability is around funding. Do you have diverse funding? Not just counting on federal dollars or state dollars, but really this goes back to that whole community buy-in and the understanding that this is important and it has positive outcomes. It's what we're doing the work for. It's the reason why we are in the field that we are, and it provides kind of an opportunity for us to really speak to funders on a level of effectiveness. And again, kind of go back to the best bargain for the money that they're spending, and it makes us more competitive in those areas. All right, so I don't have the worksheet. I thought I'd modified. This is the the PowerPoint that I used at the workshop. I thought I'd modified it. So let's just talk about what we need to do to look at choosing evidence-based practices and programs. Some of this is going to be, kind of a bit repetitive, but that's because it is important to understand kind of what you need to be doing. Certainly, you want an evidence-based program to fit the need of your community. So if you are going to be looking for, let's say, an evidence-based clinical practice or counseling program, then you're going to want to find those that are specific to that particular field. And there are resources and lists out there that'll actually allow you to sort through some of those things. And I'll give you a list of what those are. But identify the need and then look for the programs that are specific to that need. And you actually can go in and search based upon, mentoring programs or, positive connections or anger management or fiscal management or recreation. You just can get very specific in the search features and get a list of all of those programs that have been identified as evidence-based or evidence-driven. Look again at your agency's ability to implement this program. What's it going to need in terms of staff time, in terms of the cost of materials, logistics, do you need space, all of those types of things. Looking at the programs and critically appraising the evidence of the programs. This is where I think that it kind of can get confusing for agencies, because if you go out and if you just did a Google search, let's say you just did a Google search on evidence-based, mentoring programs, then the list that you get is in the thousands. And you go on a website and the website says that it's evidence-based, but is that enough? And it really isn't enough. So we'll kind of talk. I'll give you some guidelines about the steps that you would take to actually identify the validity of their claim as evidence-based, because I do think that's important. It reminds me of, just because it says evidence-based on the internet doesn't always mean that that really is evidence-based. And I said it reminds me of that Farm Bureau commercial where the woman believes everything's true just because it's on the internet. Certainly that's not the case, and we need to be critical in thinking, in evaluating that claim to be evidence-based. Looking at all of these things to pick your program and then your ability to evaluate the effectiveness of the delivery of those services based upon all of those needs. Again, that evaluating the effectiveness can't be overstated in terms of its importance, because we have to follow the program with fidelity in order to get the same type of effective outcomes that have been established in research. There are a lot of credible sources, so you guys don't have to go out and do that Google search, and I say that's probably not the best way to do it. But there are a list of agencies or sources that have already done this, that already have compiled a list of evidence-based practices and evidence-based programs. Many of these will give you even the distinction of whether it's evidence-based, whether it's evidence-driven, or whether it's a best practice based upon the evaluation and the type of evaluation or research that has been done, so you can get really specific. But the kind of most common and most used credible sources for evidence-based practices and program in the youth service field are the ones that are listed here. Certainly SAMHSA's National Registry of Evidence, it's supposed to say evidence-based practices and programs. Many of you use the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency model program listing, and that one is really good and very, very comprehensive. You'll see a lot of crossover if you look at both of these. Child Trends is not federally. SAMHSA and OJJDP are federal sources. Child Trends is not a federal source, but it is a recognized source of credible listings for evidence-based programs, as well as the Child Welfare League and What Works, and then you have promising practices as well. So you kind of can see those distinctions. And again, just from a national kind of overview of credible sources, these are the ones that tend to be used most often in youth services. If you want to, so you find a program, you think that it's going to be effective, and you want to be able to really evaluate the credibility of their claim for evidence-based program. The TAPUS model, TAPUS, whatever, how you ever say that, TAPUPAS model for evaluating that claim is probably a very, very good model to use in terms of kind of critically appraising that claim for evidence-based. And it actually is an acronym for what you want to look for. Transparency being the first. Is it open to scrutiny? If you have all of the research out there, if it has numerous kind of applications and it's been looked at by more than one type of academia or research, been done by more than one person, that they give you all of the information that is important. I think that this is really, really, again, kind of important in our critical thinking, is that they tell you how many kids were involved. What was their pool number? How long did they look at this? Did they have a control group? And if they didn't have a control group, did they try to make any comparisons, to folks who were not receiving these services for whatever reason, kind of a natural control group? You certainly want to know who's doing the research, because if it is, a lot of the evidence driven and best practices, that evaluation is done by the agency themselves, or by the person who is trying to sell you the material. And we all know that, you can say things the way that you want them to be, said, without really kind of lying about it. So you want to be very, very critical in understanding who is actually doing that research. And it is kind of you have enough information to understand how they reached their conclusions. And if they're not giving you all of this information that really allows you to understand how they're reaching the conclusions, who they used in their subject group and that kind of thing, then that should be a red flag, because transparency is one of those just, standards of good methodology in research, no matter what type of research it is. You want to be able to replicate it, and you want to be able, and a lot of times they will actually, in their interpretations of the research, talk about maybe some limitations as well, so that they understand, and you see that they understand the difficulty that can often be in place in doing research in human services. You want to look at accuracy in terms of, is it well grounded? Are there recommendations and conclusions based upon actual data that they can tell you how it was collected? Or are they just kind of making assumptions? We think that this works because, our kids really like it. That's not research. That's not evidence-based even around that. So look at how they are kind of generating those conclusions, and look at its purpose. Is it fit for the purpose that you need? And if you think about, kind of what you are trying to accomplish, does this research speak to those same questions or those same goals? Because your purpose needs to match. And an example might be if you were trying to do, I'll say you're picking a program to enhance communication skills within the family, then if the research is really more around managing anger, those types of things, and I know that that's kind of a broad example, but that certainly wouldn't fit the purpose of the research. The utility is really about how well you can take that research and apply it to, is it practical, really is what this is about. Can you use it by others? Does it give you enough information? Does it give you enough guidelines that you can actually use this? So whether it's in a program or with activities or curriculum, does it give you enough information to be able to duplicate it and use it, in the way that you will get those same results? You do have to look at propriety in terms of, again, this kind of goes back to, was the research conducted with the consent of stakeholders? Was it within those ethical guidelines? Are they trying to sell you something? I think, and this may be my own personal prejudice, but I think that if you are buying a product, then that requires, the consumer to be even more critical in terms of appraising the outcomes around that, because they have something at stake if they are charging you for the curriculum. And if they have something at stake, then I think that you really need to look, keep that in mind when you're looking at who is actually doing that research. Is there a conflict of interest? Is there maybe an ulterior motive in their making the claims for being evidence-based? It has to be accessible. Accessible kind of ties to that utility in terms of, it has to allow you to be able to understand it. You don't, obviously a academic research paper is going to be filled with some very, kind of methodology terms that may be hard for the layperson to understand. So, you have to be able to sort through that, or they have to be able to give you that information in a way that's easy to understand and not use that technical jargon. A lot of times, and again, maybe this is my own kind of a tendency toward being cynical, but a lot of times if they're using a lot of technical jargon that seems to be kind of hiding the results, then it should be kind of a red flag. If they can't just, state it plainly in terms that you understand, then what are they trying to hide? So kind of being aware of that. And then it has to be specific to what your needs are. Again, if it is going to be demonstrated, if it's demonstrating success, did they include all of the factors? So let's say they're taking mentoring, and they're talking about the success of mentoring, but did they include the family makeup of the young person? Because that also could um, influence the outcomes. I remember that there was, when I was in indirect service, was looking at some residential programs for uh, one of my clients, a young person, and went to visit it was a residential program in the state of Indiana, and they were talking about their effectiveness. They had this really high, positive outcome rate and all this kind of thing. And then when we went to fill out the application, their application and selection process was really biased toward those young people who had certain skills in place that will allow them to be effective. So you kind of have to take into account those, how they're screening their subjects, the participants in the study, how they're measuring those outcomes around those types of things. Questions so far? We're almost done. Let's see if there's any questions as we're going through this. I have created this kind of decision checklist in terms if you are in the process of looking at evidence-based, or at some point you want to, if you're in the maybe like I said, the paper implementation, or the process implementation of choosing an evidence-based program. This is just like a really quick, easy checklist for looking at that a specific program or practice and determining whether or not it fits the need for your agency, for the clients that you are um, targeting for the service, and your ability then to kind of provide that service. And I will say that the recorded session is going to be available, and if you want this as a PDF copy, then again, just email me so that you can have this as well. So you can have this kind of checklist and just kind of look at, something that can be just really quick and easy and go through, especially if you're looking through one of those registries or the model programs, and just kind of very quickly eliminating or collecting a group of programs that may work for you. All right, so this was group work that we did in the actual face-to-face webinar or workshop that I did last week. But I do want to show you that I have all of these registries listed, which include the websites for each of these. So again, if you either look at the recorded session or you request the copy of the PDF, you will have these listed. Some of these are the same things that you may have seen in the RFP. I do have a couple of additional registries that are listed as well. And then we have a list of my references in terms of a lot of the research that's out there. And this is a good starting point if you want to do some initial exploration of what the research is out there, and each of these then will provide you kind of with additional places to go. But I will open it up for, it's been just about an hour, open it up for any questions that you guys may have. I said this was just meant to be a basic introduction. Hopefully it has done that. Questions, comments, snide remarks, type them in. Yeah. Okay. I'm reading Kim's remarks and talking specifically about one of her programs, which is the emergency use shelter component in terms of what they're using for evidence-based. If this is something that is of interest to you, in whether it's the shelter program, or if you're doing mentoring, you want to see what other people are doing in mentoring. If it's teen court, if there's enough interest, then I think that I would be happy to create a go-to meeting to host kind of that conversation among programs. But you just would have to let me know that that would be something that you're interested in doing. I think there's some value, and that's the piece of that I think that we lose kind of the value of the online presentation in not being able to have those conversations. But we certainly can create those opportunities for you if you're interested in doing that. Anyone else have any suggestions, any specific requests around, additional information on evidence-based stuff? Any clarifications? It's really hard for me to tell on GoToMeeting if anyone is typing, so I never know. Okay, well, I think everyone should have my email, but I am going to go ahead and type it in here so that if you do have any questions, if you have any specific request, whether it's for the agency assessment tool or anything else that I had mentioned, a copy of this PowerPoint and PDF so that you have it as a resource. You have that. If you would like a certificate of attendance, just send me the names of the participants. I know that we have a couple of groups on as opposed to individuals. So just let me know if you would like a certificate of attendance, and I can send that as well. But if there are no other questions, I want to thank you for spending an hour with me today. I hope that you found it helpful. If you have any feedback about this specific topic and the whole process in general, again, I welcome those. This is meant to be as helpful as possible. So if there are things that I'm not doing or I could do better, or things that are missing, please let me know so that I can incorporate those in our future online trainings. You are very, very welcome. Thanks, guys. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your week and that everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. And hopefully I'll see a lot of you at the IYA conference as well. Thanks so much.